Hello again. We turn today to a new unit of the course that goes by the rather vague heading Second Italian Film Renaissance. This does not refer to a distinctive movement like the French New Wave, nor does it refer to a cinematic genre like epic or film noir. Rather, it's really just a loose historical grouping of major Italian directors, all of them auteurs, whose work came to prominence in the 1960s and 70s. I've adopted this umbrella term from David Cook, who uses it in his excellent comprehensive book, A History of Narrative Film. The major directors who fall under this imprecise designation include Federico Fellini, Pierpaolo Pasolini, Michelangelo Antonioni, Gio Pontecorvo, and Bernardo Bertolucci, who was 15 to 20 years younger than the other directors, but who began his career precociously in his 20s. We'll be studying works by the last three of these five filmmakers, but in order to understand their place in cinema history, it helps to know something about what immediately preceded it. If these extremely diverse directors represent a so-called second film renaissance in Italy, well, what was the first? The answer is a movement called Italian neorealism, which emerged among Italy's ruined cities and shattered culture in the years immediately following World War II and continued into the 1950s. Unlike the second wave of great Italian filmmaking that we're studying, the major neorealists were self-consciously unified as a movement by a particular theory and practice of filmmaking. But unlike the French New Wave directors, they operated from a kind of formal manifesto devised by a theorist named Cesare Zavattini, who had strong convictions about both the style and subject of film. His guiding principles shaped a movement that was enormously fertile and influential in its time, but it lasted only a little over a decade. Zavattini regarded contemporary Italian film in the early 1940s as artificial, stagey, and inauthentic. He lamented that most Italian productions were utterly divorced from real life as regular people lived it, what he called, quote, the sacredness of ordinary life. Worse still, Zavattini believed that filmmakers were morally indifferent on the whole to the plight of the common people who were struggling in their daily lives. The three great practitioners of Italian neorealism, Vittorio De Sica, Roberto Rossellini, and Luchino Visconti, all adhered to this social and stylistic vision of Zavattini's, but to differing degrees, and all of them eventually moved beyond it. But early in their careers, they were inspired by Zavattini's Revolutionary Manifesto, published while the war was still going on, and modestly titled Some Ideas on the Cinema. In this treatise, Zavattini first urged Italian filmmakers to capture real life by loosening the mechanism of plot, which he regarded as contrived and inauthentic. He insisted that our real experience doesn't conform to the exigencies of any kind of dramatic structure, so neither should a film. Now, there is often a sense of inevitability in the plots, so to speak, of Italian neorealist films, but that sense of inevitability grows logically out of the bleak economic circumstances, not from the design of any scriptwriter. This is true in the most famous of all neorealist films. You may have seen it. Vittorio De Sica's Bicycle Thieves, where a man whose bicycle has been stolen in the immediate post-war years is driven by poverty to steal the bicycle of another man in order to try to keep his job. Inevitably, he's captured as his young son Bruno watches in horror. Well, in embracing Zavattini's insistence that films should concentrate on the everyday lives of ordinary people, the neorealist directors sought to capture their day-to-day experiences. And while this included showing their struggle to survive economically after the war, the directors also presented closely observed portraits of how working-class people simply went about the quotidian business of living and conducted their lives, challenging though they were, with remarkable dignity. Now, the neorealist focus both on the ordinary and the here and now challenged the fascists' prior use of cinema in the 1930s as a way of advancing myths of Italy's heroic grandeur. The representation in Italian neorealism of commonplace experience was very different, and it meant using a kind of documentary style with patient camera work showing familiar details, recognizable details of real contemporary Italian life. Zavattini insisted that film should depict, quote, unconditionally what is today, today, today. Well, Rossellini's Rome Open City, released in 1945, shortly after the liberation of Rome, is a depiction of the communist underground in what is really the purest expression of Italian neorealist cinema verite. Shot in the ravaged streets of Rome, the film looks so authentic, so much like a contemporary newsreel with its low-quality film stock and absence of a cohesive plot, that its first audience thought that they were watching a record of actual events. Now, in order to heighten the sense of documentary truth, Zavattini proposed an even more radical policy: the abolition of professional actors in neorealist films, and the use instead of untrained individuals whose very rough ordinariness and life experience in the social world presented in the film would give them authenticity and an emotional resonance. Well, neorealist directors didn't always abide by this rule, but De Sica does with the father and son in Bicycle Thieves, with extraordinary results arising from his absolute faith in the expressive powers of these untrained performers. Similarly, in La Terra Trema, perhaps the greatest of all neorealist films, though by no means the most typical, Visconti relies exclusively on untrained actors who lived in the Sicilian fishing village where the film is set. Still another neorealist tenet derived from Zavattini was that directors should avoid studio sets in filming and always shoot on location, using the actual streets or countryside, a view that they shared with the French New Wave. There was also a political dimension to this movement, however. Zavattini and the neorealist directors were convinced that man's fundamental reality is social reality. This is a Marxist theoretical presumption, but not one that necessarily carried a Marxist political solution for the filmmakers. While all three of the great neo-realist directors who I've mentioned were leftists, only Visconti espoused a communist political perspective, and even this becomes vexed at times. The more characteristic approach to social reality in neo-realist films, while inherently political, is fundamentally humanistic. It's not a summons to Marxist revolution, as in Eisenstein, for example, but rather it's a compassionate representation of ordinary people caught in impossible social and economic circumstances, presented with deep sympathy. Well, this brings us to the final foundational element of neorealism: its ethical urgency for the plight of the oppressed and the desire to move the audience to moral action outside the cinema by engaging our sympathetic emotions of identification with the characters. And toward this end, in Bicycle Thieves, De Sica shows the quest of the desperate father and his devoted son to reclaim a stolen bike amid anonymous post-war buildings, and we see what they are up against. We see the evidence of the post-war world. Pawn shops where the poor hawk their family heirlooms, grimy bicycle markets, and soup kitchens. All of these were real places in Rome, okay? All of them marked by poverty that the audience would recognize and sympathize with deeply. Well, to give you a characteristic taste of neorealist cinema, here's a clip from another De Sica masterpiece, this one made in 1952, Umberto D., scripted by Zavattini himself in accordance with his own theories, his own neorealist credo. It's the story of an old man named Umberto that accumulates episodically without much of a sense of any kind of plot, and certainly without anything like a clear narrative resolution. The aging Umberto survives on a meager pension, but he's facing eviction from his small Roman apartment. In search of a loan, he appeals to his old acquaintances, but they either can't or won't help him. His landlady is a heartless predator. Toward the end of the film, Umberto is so robbed of his dignity that he anticipates that he would have to beg and live on the streets. But unwilling to do this, he plans instead to commit suicide. But he is concerned about one thing. He's concerned about the fate of his beloved small dog, Feike. And so he tries unsuccessfully to give the dog away. But when this fails, Umberto tries and fails to abandon the dog. And this fails, of course, too, because the dog understands it and tries to save Umberto's life. Here's the film's ending, in which the compassionate bond between Umberto and his four-legged companion stands in stark contrast to the amoral self-interest of the society around him. Have a look.
Daniela, cammina. qui, Fly. Fly, su. 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 Bravo, Fly. Bravo, Fly. Bravo. Bravo. Corri, Fly. Corri. 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 Corri, Fly. Su. Vieni. Corri, Fly.
By the mid-1950s, the neo-realist impulse had died out, and Italian studios were churning out mass-produced, non-serious entertainment that featured spectacle and mild sexual titillation. The 5 directors in the second film renaissance that we'll be studying, who I mentioned at the start of this lecture, emerge after this period of creative decline following neo-realism, which was essentially worn out by the second half of the 1950s. So in the 1960s and 70s, this new renaissance of directors respond to the tradition of neo-realism, but they do so in differing ways. Federico Fellini's first great film, Vitellini. Il Vitellini is about a group of aimless young men in a seaside town, and it incorporates, as it would almost have to, given the influence, many of the neo-realist elements that I've mentioned. But by the time Fellini made his masterpieces of the mid-1950s, films like La Strada and Nights at Cabiria, he had already broken sharply with the neo-realist ideas and style and was developing his own symbol-laden works of myth-making that dominated his career thereafter in masterworks like La Dolce Vita and Eight and a Half. Now, politically, Pasolini, a Marxist novelist and essayist, is the closest to Zavattini's communist neo-realist vision among the 5 generations of the second wave Renaissance. Like Fellini, Pasolini's earliest films, The Beggar and Mamma Roma, are in the neo-realist tradition and idiom. They're uncompromising studies of Roman lowlife, filmed on location using non-professional actors and espousing a clear Marxist perspective. But Pasolini's probably greatest film, The Gospel According to St. Matthew in 1964, merged his political vision and filmic style with Christian myth. It's the life of Christ using untrained actors. Pasolini's spare cinema verite style implicitly mocks Hollywood spectacle versions of Jesus' life. And it is, I think, still the most dynamic and convincing version of the gospel ever filmed. But the film departs from neorealism in its examination of a non-contemporary subject, and it points toward Pasolini's own later movement toward allegory and myth, not unlike Fellini. Well, among the 3 directors of this wave of Second Italian Renaissance that we'll be studying, all 3 of them set their works outside the explicitly contemporary Italian setting that was so crucial to the neo-realists. Some of Antonioni's major works are set in Italy, but Blow Up, which we'll be considering today, takes place in London. Zabriskie Point in Death Valley, California, and The Passenger in Chad, North Africa. Gillo Portacovo's The Battle of Algiers is set in a civil war in Algeria, not Italy, and half of Bertolucci's The Conformist, as we'll see, takes place in France during the late 1930s, not during the contemporary movement. Now, as we'll see, both Portacovo and Bertolucci were certainly concerned with politics in their best work, but they explore social upheaval and revolutionary movements from a more nuanced perspective than the Marxist one that Zavattini urged the neo-realists to embrace and advance. Stylistically, these 2 directors also borrow and depart from neo-realism in various ways and to differing degrees. Portacovo's The Battle of Algiers strives for a level of precise documentary reconstruction of the civil war in Algeria, and in so doing recalls Rossellini's Roman Open City. And one might say also that, like neo-realistic works, his film follows, largely sympathetically, members of the resistance, much as we find in Rome Open City, the Algerian underground in their fight with the colonial French is the focus here. But the film has nothing to do with Italy, after all, and the horrific events that we see leading up to the liberation of Algeria in the 1950s and early 60s move us to ethical uncertainties, I suppose we might say, of a kind that we don't really find in most neo-realist films. Now, Bertolucci's political vision in works like Before the Revolution and The Conformist and 1900, his epic, is even more deeply cynical than anything we find in neo-realist theory or practice, as he investigates the origins of fascism and its complex associations with sexual aberration. Moreover, Bertolucci's flamboyant visual style completely cuts ties with neo-realism. It bears no kinship to cinema verite at all, as his films, among other things, shift back and forth in time, incorporate dazzling camera movements, as well as elements of expressionism and surrealism, all of which Zavattini would have found absolutely abhorrent. But among the 5 second Italian Renaissance directors that I've mentioned, and among the 3 that we're studying, it is Antonioni's work, I think, that reveals the most complete and decisive and totalizing break from neorealism in subject and in style. Now, note that stylistically, Antonioni is innovative and always demanding. Characteristically, there is in his films a minimal use of dialogue and minimal music, and this places greater emphasis on the expressive power of the mise-en-scène, on the camera movements, on the diegetic background noises, and above all, it places greater emphasis on the actors' gestures in order to evoke their interior states. Thus, Antonioni says of the performers in his films, quote, "The attitude or pose of the actor, as determined under my direction, cannot but help to affect the framing of that scene, and I, not the actor, am the one who can know whether that effect is appropriate or not." Spoken like a true auteur. Well, structurally, Antonioni's films aren't loose and episodic like neo-realist works. They are rather carefully crafted, but slowly developing, oblique, and often deliberately disjunctive when we first watch them. Now, this is because, as Antonioni puts it, describing L'Avventura after its premiere at the Cannes Film Festival, he said, quote, "I have eliminated all the logical narrative transitions, all those connective links between sequences where one sequence served as a springboard for the one that followed." Now, that may sound a little familiar because the same is true of Andrei Rublev, you'll recall. But, unlike Tarkovsky, Antonioni's films remain notoriously open-ended. There's no sense of resolution or conclusion the way there is in Andrei Rublev. They remain mystifyingly unresolved, and nowhere more flagrantly, opaquely so, than at the end of Blow Up, in which we find the baffling mime tennis game. But just as mystifying and unresolved is the ending of his first great film, made in 1960, Antonioni's L'Avventura. Here, a party of vacationers cruising on a yacht in the Mediterranean come ashore on a small island off the coast of Sicily. One member of their party, a woman named Anna, unaccountably disappears, vanishes without a trace. The others, including Anna's lover, Sandro, search for her on the island for days. But in the process, Sandro finds himself attracted to another woman in their group, Claudia, and the two eventually become lovers. The police can find no signs of Anna, nor are there any hints of foul play, and they rule out suicide. The missing woman never returns, and the search for her that started with urgency and desperation turns to boredom, both for the searching characters and also, deliberately, for the audience. Now, one reason for this effect of moving from urgency to boredom is that Antonioni uses long sequence shots, extended takes throughout the film in order to equate film time with audience time. That is, we experience the long scenes of futile searching as the characters themselves experience it. We share the same temporal reality that they do, because Antonioni doesn't use any time-compressing editing cuts of the kind we expect in film. Now, as critics have pointed out, by doing this, Antonioni transfers to the audience the psychological experience of the characters, as I've suggested, first desperation and urgency, and then a kind of boring malaise and confusion. He brings us into their lives through these long takes, also with a minimum of dialogue. Now, we'll see that this identification with the protagonist or character also happens in Blow Up, especially during the long takes when we watch as the photographer, Thomas, enlarges and assembles and attempts to interpret the shots that he took in the park. As in the search for Anna in L'Avventura, the scenes that we find there are those in which the audience and the protagonist Thomas share not just the same sense of time, but also we share with Thomas the same hermeneutic labor, as in L'Avventura and in Thomas's dark room. We share in the search for clues and an attempt to find some meaning, to solve a disappearance, or to solve what appears to be a murder. Now, consider the effect of this investing the audience with the experience and temporal reality of the protagonist through a long take during the search for Anna in a scene from L'Avventura. It will, I think, prepare us for something comparable when we get to Blow Up. Have a look.
L'avete trovata?
You'll note in this clip Antonioni's use of a tracking camera here to follow individual characters as they move across the rocky island, sometimes showing one of them, then without a cut, moving in a sequence shot to another. Now, although there are occasional editing cuts in this, not many, but there are a few, they shift us in space from one searching character to another, but they do not shift us in time. We experience the search in the same time frame as the characters, minute by minute, as they do, with a growing sense of unease, a gathering sense of urgency and anxiety at this point. We also get extended shots here of the landscape, sometimes showing the searchers in the distance as they hunt for clues in extreme long shots. This produces, again, the sense of unease and frustration in the audience which we share with these characters. And Antonioni achieves all of this without really any dialogue at all, only the sound of the indifferent wind and the waves of the sea. Well, Antonioni's penchant for long takes and for showing slow, minimal movements within those takes is probably the most distinctive hallmark of his style. And the most celebrated and famous example of this is a 7-minute single take at the end of his 1975 film, The Passenger. It stars Jack Nicholson as a television news reporter who, in the midst of a midlife crisis, finds a corpse in a Moroccan hotel room and assumes the identity of this dead man. This bid at self-liberation by changing identity and shucking off his own ends tragically, however, because Nicholson doesn't know that the dead man was a political operative involved in a dangerous third world guerrilla war. So, mistaken for the man whose identity he has assumed, in the film's final scene, Nicholson is shot to death. But we don't see this. Rather, we hear it in a long take. The closing 7-minute shot looks out from an open hotel window, where Nicholson is staying, out onto a dusty Sahara Desert town square as people come and go, including the killers. After holding steady for a few minutes, the camera then very slowly zooms and tracks out through the bars of the window into the square, while inside the room in the hotel, we hear but don't see the assassination take place. Now, unlike Portakova in the Battle of Algiers, Antonioni isn't interested in North African revolutionary politics, nor, like the neo-realist, is he concerned with documenting the struggles of day-to-day social life, nor the political life of the poor per se. He's not interested in that really at all. As we'll see when we turn shortly to Blow Up, his thematic concerns are more metaphysical, psychological, and aesthetic. It's not that there isn't an awareness of social and class injustice in the film Blow Up, but that's simply not where he is invested. Now, in Antonioni's words, quote, "Modern cinema is not so much concerned with externals as it is with those other forces that move us to act in a certain way and not in another." Now, we'll see these other interior psychological forces, curiosity, desire, guilt, among those other forces, fully displayed in Blow Up. But before turning to this remarkable film, I'll mention one last feature of Antonioni's style, and that is his expressionistic use of landscapes and colors to evoke psychological atmospheres. As in his film Red Desert, for example, we see this. It is set in an industrial wasteland outside the Italian city of Ravenna and deals with the strained relationship of an erotic woman and her engineer husband. Great poisonous gas clouds of yellow smoke fill the air during the day, and chemical dyes cast a nightmarish glow on the slag heaps of the blighted landscape, all of which reflect the psychological states of the characters, states of desperation, moral corruption that reflect the moral corruption and decadence and alienation of modern civilization itself, in Antonioni's view. In another film, Zabriskie Point, one of Antonioni's least successful films, He uses the stark, unforgiving landscape of Death Valley as an evocative backdrop to suggest the sterility of the revolutionary fantasies of an American hippie and a college student who meet in Death Valley and have sex in this desert world. Now, in Blow Up, Antonioni was so concerned about the expressionistic effects of London colors that he actually altered some of the city's real colors in order to create these effects. He had, for example, houses in the driving scenes painted brighter shades of red and blue to intensify the unrestrained, fluorescent, mind-blowing excesses of swinging London in the mid-1960s. He did so to make the urban mise-en-scène, in short, more psychedelic. But beneath this world of glamour and hypersensuality and drugs, Antonioni explores a host of dark themes that reverberate not just in Blow Up, but throughout his entire career. Chief among these themes in his work, I think, is modern alienation. Antonioni once referred to himself as, quote, the poet of loneliness, and this condition haunts all of his films, from the shots of isolated searchers on the rocky island in La Ventura to the man in his hotel room as assassins arrive in The Passenger, to the photographer in Blow Up, alone in his dark room. All representations of kinds of alienation. Now, two of his bleakest films, aptly titled The Night and The Eclipse, explore this through disintegrating relationships and the ennui that results from them. The former, The Night, focuses on an unfaithful married couple in Milan, and the latter on a young woman who abandons her older lover for a wealthy materialist stockbroker. Well, together with La Ventura, The Night and The Eclipse form what is often called Antonioni's trilogy. They're independent films unrelated to one another, but linked as a trilogy in their studies of intense alienation. Now, in Blow Up, the photographer Thomas lives alone and begins the film, and is throughout much of it, a complete alienated narcissist. He's bored with the beautiful but shallow women that he photographs for a living and that he beds, and he lusts after his friend's wife, but at the same time harbors a misogynistic disdain for women in general. He despises fashion shoots and their contrived representations of reality. Indeed, he's tired of the artificial world of London itself when we find him at the beginning of the film. The studio where he works is a site of alienation and estrangement, not just from other human beings, but also a site of estrangement from material reality, because in that studio, through his photographs, he produces fantasy images. Reality there is mediated by designer clothing, by makeup, by artificial lighting. And the camera, which has, one would think, the capacity to authenticate the world and reveal it as true, and even reveal its hidden truths as a kind of objective medium, instead, the camera serves in that studio as a mediating and distorting instrument, one that creates the distortions that appear on the pages of fashion magazines, the fantasies, not the reality. Relationships in this world of the photographer's studio, and indeed London itself, are similarly mediated, inauthentic, and marked by a total lack of communication, which is altogether appropriate for Antonioni, in which dialogue is generally minimal. The fact that Antonioni, in fact, opens and closes this film non-verbally with the antics of a troupe of mimes suggests the prevailing communicative breakdown and failure of language within modern culture, and certainly within mod London. Now, as we'll see in the film, conversations, when they do occur, are usually marked by indirection and incompleteness or misunderstanding. Random sex, often anonymous and with multiple partners, replaces actual interpersonal communication and connection in this modern world that Antonioni critiques in Blow Up, I think, so unsparingly. Now, as a participant in such soulless sexual encounters, Thomas is bored and estranged. He wants, quote, to escape, he says, into something more genuine. So he is putting together a book of photographs of what he calls real documentary subjects, not what he does in his studio, but rather shots that include war, privation, poverty, and refugees. In fact, he takes photos of the couple that he sees in the park because he wants a spontaneous shot of something that is real but less disturbing and less depressing to close this collection after so many violent images preceded in the collection. Ironically, though, when Thomas, as we'll see, enlarges the images he's taken in the park, he finds violence in what had appeared to be something peaceful, happy, ordinary. And he finds practiced deception also when he develops the photographs in what had seemed a couple's spontaneous embrace. Now, this brings us to a second major Antonioni film that he explores quintessentially in Blow Up, and that is the entwined questions of epistemology and interpretation. The film is centrally concerned with the paradoxical and ultimately elusive nature of reality as the subjective eye and mind perceive it and interpret it as well. What is captured by a camera is, as I've suggested, only theoretically objective and empirical. It might seem more accurate and detailed, the image that a photographer sees, than, say, a painting. But the fact is that, like the naked eye of a photographer, or like any eye, what the camera registers, in fact, is subject to interpretation. The meaning of any photographic image or series of images requires subjective interpretation through the arrangement of those images and through inference about them, leaving the final meaning of those images registered by the objective camera, the final meaning, subjective and deeply ambiguous. Antonioni reminds us in this film that no two minds perceive reality the same way or interpret what they see the same way. And Blow Up itself, indeed, not surprisingly, has enlisted an unusually wide range of interpretive readings. At the center of the film is a silent sequence, as we'll see next time, in which Thomas arranges black and white enlargements from the park in a quasi-cinematic sequence of successive images, and in his attempt to understand them, a succession of images that mimic the frames of the very film that we are watching. Thomas, in arranging these, tries to decode them just as we try to decode Antonioni's film. Thus, we begin there with what really amounts to a detective story, but one that never explains how or why the presumed murder in the park caught on film and revealed through magnification ever occurred. We know that there's a dead body, but how or why, we don't know. The reality behind the sequence of enlarged photographs remains unresolved. Thomas's visit to the park at night confirms the presence of a real corpse, but neither he nor we ever know the murderer's identity or motive. Now, Antonioni based the script for Blow Up, which he wrote himself, on a short story by the Peruvian writer Julio Cortázar, but he removed scenes from the original story through compression and ellipsis, as he called it, because he felt that if he had kept those parts of the story in, they would have made the identity of the killer more explicit, as they do in Cortázar's work. So instead, all we get in the film of the presumed killer is a fleeting glimpse of a car following the photographer's car containing a man in a dark jacket and the woman that he photographed in the park. That's as close as we get even to seeing the presumed killer. The truth behind the killing in Blow Up ultimately is as remote and as invisible as that tennis ball is in the mime game that we see at the end of the film. Yet, as in L'Avventura, Antonioni creates what he called, quote, a state of tension. In some ways, a state of tension that becomes all the more intense because of this uncertainty. It's a state of tension in which the viewer shares the feelings of the central characters, for reasons I explained, as they too, in this case Thomas, seek a solution, like the search for Anna in L'Avventura. But in Antonioni's films, this tension ends not with a resolution of the kind we desire or expect, but rather ends with a withdrawal into a sense of the inexplicable, both in L'Avventura and in Blow Up. Antonioni said of the film, quote, "The photographer wants to see something more closely, but when he enlarges the object, it breaks up and disappears. So there's a moment when one grasps reality, but the next moment it eludes us. This is roughly the meaning of Blow Up." Well, by design then, Antonioni's film is not only about the limits of interpretation and knowledge, but is itself a hermeneutic puzzle that challenges and teases our interpretive capacities. And for this reason, it has fascinated and frustrated not just film critics, but also philosophers. And the film's profound ambiguity has made it a magnet for literary critics as well. Like the photographer, we may think we've gotten to the truth for a moment, but we're constantly forced, as he is, to revise our judgment until finally nothing is clear. Thomas believes at first that his presence in the park prevented a murder, but then he realizes that he didn't prevent it. And the fact that Thomas traffics in photographic images makes clear another self-reflexive theme in Blow Up. And that is Antonioni's meditation, here and elsewhere, but especially here, on the ethics of filmmaking. Antonioni once observed, quote, "I think Blow Up is my most autobiographical film." What's he mean? Well, his ethical concern with photography seems to have grown for Antonioni out of his own early attempt to make a documentary film in the late 1930s about a mental institution. Here's how he describes it. As he turned on the camera, the inmates tried desperately to get away from the camera and the lights, as if they were being attacked by some kind of prehistoric monster. It was the head of the asylum who yelled, "Stop, lights off." And as the room became silent and subdued, we saw a slow and feeble movement of bodies that seemed to be in the final stages of agony. The camera terrified them. The camera was invasive. Well, while shooting in the park, Thomas, similarly with his camera, is an invasive voyeur. The camera, with its penetrating power, invades private worlds, and it has the power to disrupt lives, as Jane, the unwitting object of his photographs, protests to him. Well, even though a photo, as noted, can never reveal the truth, even as a seemingly objective medium, even though it can't reveal the truth, it nonetheless, images and the camera have the power to disturb because they can violate personal lives. As a man behind the camera himself, Antonioni was concerned with the ethics of filmmaking throughout his career, but especially in Blow Up. Here are some of the questions, I think, that he poses through Thomas that we'll consider about the ethics of the camera. What are the moral responsibilities of a director? Where does one draw the line between public and private space? And is filmmaking, like film viewing, inherently voyeuristic? If so, has the camera, under patriarchy, become an instrument of male sexual power and objectification? All of these questions we'll see in Blow Up. Now, I mention this last question in particular because an audience in 2020 is likely to recoil at Thomas's abuse of women during the glamour shoots, particularly the simulated sex that he enacts with one particular model, as if the camera were a kind of phallic extension. But I would point out that we are meant to be appalled by this. It is not an instance in which I think in 1965 Antonioni meant us in any way to be anything other than disgusted and horrified by it. I think we're perhaps simply more attuned to his intention here today than audiences were at the time. Well, as a critique of moral decadence in modern life, Blow Up casts a scathing eye on the sexual revolution of the 1960s. Nevertheless, the orgiastic scenes in Thomas's studio, despite his attempt to render them decidedly unappealing. Nonetheless, they were banned in Italy as too erotic when the film came out. Now, amid the changes in modern morals and manners, Antonioni shows us in Blow Up glimpses of outmoded institutions, such as nuns and palace guards, and the dusty antique store where Thomas buys a useless fragment of the past, a wooden propeller. Okay, there is then a tension, as we'll see, between a kind of ossified past and an alienated and completely fragmentary modernity. With this in mind, let's have a close look at the epic-making film's beginning, the credit sequence, and then what immediately follows it. Have a look.
Blue 439. Blue 439, over.
Blue 439, go ahead, please, over.
Phone Western 0219. Tell them I'm on my way, will you?
Roger, Wilco. Stand by.
We begin the credits with a green field upon which the film title and credits appear in transparent letters. And within these transparent letters, we see the writhing forms of young revelers in day glow colors, all of which is accompanied by a jazz score. The edges of these large translucent letters are a strange, unnatural blue-green, establishing immediately what one critic terms the film's chromatic overture. We get the natural color of vegetation here contrasting with the chemical, artificial shades that Antonioni associates with contemporary 60s culture. Antonioni observed that this culture had changed, quote, English life, changed customs and morality for the young. And we see those changes, obviously. Now, ironically, Antonioni found that English grass in this film was too green when he was filming it. And so he had the grass in London sprayed to give it a more subdued matte tone that looked more natural to the eye of this Italian. Within the film's opening 5 minutes, other binaries besides youthful contemporaneity and tradition and age, other binaries emerge besides those, and also besides nature and artifice, all of which suggest that the film is in some way structured on a series of dialectic tensions, including the ones that I have outlined for you on the handout. Note that the revelers are dressed in motley, with painted faces. They are young and carefree, and well off, even though they beg for money as a kind of anarchic amusement. And indeed, they are anarchists. They disregard traffic rules and everything else. Intercut with their antics are shots in this opening of grim-faced homeless men leaving their shelter, a London flophouse. They are as washed out in their colors and dress as the revelers in their harlequin are artificially brightened in those outfits. While Antonioni is obviously revealing economic inequities in this cross-cutting, I noted, however, that Blow Up is not primarily concerned with the sociological or political aspects of this contrast. Rather, Antonioni uses the homeless men who must live by the clock as they must leave at an assigned hour each morning, as part of a kind of aesthetic contrast with the young who disdain all forms of regulation, who seem to ignore time altogether, and who embrace anarchy for its own sake. Another binary established in this overture, if you think of it, is, as I've noted, contemporaneity versus the past. The revelers push past vestiges of traditional religion. We see the nun, and of traditional British governance, as represented in the palace guard walking in front of St. James Palace. He and the nun are also wearing costumes, I suppose, if you think of it, but they're ancient costumes that seem, in their very anachronism, to amuse these young revelers in what appears to be clearly a stark contrast between modern transience and outdated cultural traditions. But Antonioni delights in ironies, and I think we find one of the most amusing in this opening sequence. Why? Well, the revelers are, almost certainly unknowingly, enacting an ancient tradition themselves, something that takes place in European cities, in which matriculating college freshmen dress up in commedia dell'arte outfits, paint their faces, and go what is called ragging at the end of March when the film opens in open-air vehicles. this is what is being represented. Now, European audiences would recognize this activity then as a living survival of an ancient custom of youthful license and merriment dating back to medieval times. I've in fact seen it myself when I've taught at universities in Belgium. But the characters who are enacting it in Blow Up seem to be unaware of this. Thus, ironically, the young who mock and discount the past are unknowingly practicing one of its customs. They are anthropologically linked to the very things they are rejecting. Now, the fact that they don't speak, but rather grunt and yell, reminds us of an even more distant primitivism underlying the medieval custom. They think of themselves, these young people, as liberated from ritual, as cut off from the past, but Antonioni reveals that they are in fact still unknowingly bound by it. Thomas, who we see standing under a railway bridge as the homeless men file past when he first emerges, Thomas is both part of the younger generation of pop trendsetters, but he is also a man who disdains that contemporary culture, who has grown very tired of it. Played by David Hemmings, Thomas hides his camera that he has used to photograph the men in the flophouse that night in a paper bag. He's wearing a torn, stained set of clothing in order to try to blend in to his surroundings, in order to capture it authentically. He has come to this homeless shelter to photograph the oppressed as part of the project of reality pictures that he later shows to a publisher. These are spontaneous photographs, he says, of living individuals, the opposite of the contrived glamour shots that he takes for a living. Thomas wants to disguise the fact that he's taking pictures so that what he captures will be more real, more genuine. Now, although he despises, as noted, both fashion work and the models that he photographs, Thomas nonetheless realizes that that work is so lucrative that he relies upon it, even as he despises it. We see this when he drives his Rolls Royce, which he waits to get into after all of the poor men have left. And we realize in the car that he not only has a secretary, but he has something almost unheard of in 1965, a car phone. He's loath to give up these spoils, if you will, and Antonioni shows him luxuriating in them with an overhead shot as he drives with the convertible top down through the city. We see Thomas at work after this. He returns to the large studio that doubles as his stylish apartment. He's late in returning, and an exotic Russian supermodel named Verushka, played in fact by the model Verushka herself, has been waiting for him rather impatiently. She announces, "I am here," because he deliberately ignores her when he enters. We first see Verushka wearing a revealing designer dress, only to discover a moment later that what we saw was her reflection in a mirrored surface. Now, this initial sleight of hand, this optical illusion, indicates, it signals that everything photographed in this studio will, in a sense, be illusory, deceptive, unreal, especially the model's poses and expressions, which are completely contrived. And at the same time, the mirrored image also calls our attention to the fact that this studio is a place of narcissism, both the photographers and the subjects he's photographing. Thus, the fashion shoot begins of Verushka. Have a look.
Right.
Punch more. That's good. On the hair back, on the hair back. Come on, that's great. That's great. That's good. Good. Come on, more of that. More of that. Now give it to me. Really give it to me. Come on now. Straight as fast as you can. As fast as you can. Give it to me. Give it to me. Come on. Right forward. Good. That's good. And again, this side. This side. Right forward. Hand up. Hand up. That's great. Just touch the face. That's very good. And again, around this way. Touch the face again. Touch the face again. Good. Now Much more, much more. Good, that's great. Yes, that's great. That's good, that's good. Yes, go on, and again, and again, and again. Oh, hold that, hold the hair down. Again. Good. Okay, Reg, 50. Right. On your back, strong. Yes, now really good. Come on. Come on, work. Great. Great, and again. Come on, back, arms up. Stretch yourself, really easy. Great. And again. Go on, go. Great. That's it. Keep it up. Lovely. Yeah, make it come. Great. Love. Head up. Love for me. Now, go on. Yes. Hello? Yeah, hold on. Just please. Hello? Hmm? Yes.
The methods that Thomas employs to get the fevered reactions he wants from the model require her to engage in erotic role-playing, specifically to mimic a state of uncontrollable sexual arousal. Thomas orders her to writhe on the ground in a display of sexual excitement that is leading her to orgasm. He does so straddling her prone body and holding the camera as they simulate sex, and he cries, "Yes, yes." Well, it seems clear that Thomas has practiced this routine with other models many times before in order to get the shots that the public crave. Note that as the shoot begins, Antonioni presents the model in the background with a bunch of dyed ostrich feathers protruding like a phallus in the foreground. Appropriately, because the phallus rules here. Under Thomas's masculine command, sex is a commodity being manufactured for the fashion industry to sell. Now, the feathers that we see are sometimes called a fluffer. They are a staple, so-called, in pornographic filmmaking. They're used to whip up sexual arousal in pornographic subjects. Here, they are used to work up models, similarly, into the required appearance of desire during the shoots. Thomas, in fact, considers using this fluffer, but he doesn't. Instead, his verbal commands, his rhythmic movements, and the use of the camera as this penetrative sexual instrument all induce the desired expression in Verushka of orgasmic pleasure that the market demands. Sex sells, even if it is a completely fabricated studio performance. But it would be wrong to say, I think, that there isn't some sexual excitation, some sexual stimulation going on here, though if it is a particularly dreary kind. When it's over, both Thomas and the model seem as if they're in a state of postcoital exhaustion, as if they've actually had sex. But they haven't, of course. The erotic pleasure here, such as it is essentially masturbatory for the model, who seems narcissistically aroused by the fact that she is being photographed, and the pleasure, such as it is for Thomas, is entirely sadistic, for he has controlled and commandeered the entire episode with cries like, "Now the hair, lie on your back," and seems to be getting off on the power of ordering the model to perform. Well, the fantasy being sold here, obviously, in this fashion shoot, is that a woman is so aroused that she cannot control herself, to be associated then by men and women who see this ad with what she is wearing, from lipstick to gown. After a moment, both Thomas and Verushka are bored. Boredom is their default position. Thomas later complains, London doesn't do anything for me. The angles and the movements of Antonioni's camera in the first half of the shoot you just saw are important. Its positions and shifts of Antonioni's camera replicate Thomas's own body movements as he circles around the model. But Antonioni's camera angles also replicate the angles of Thomas's own still camera as Antonioni moves alongside him. At times, Antonioni shoots over Thomas's shoulder, looking down as Thomas's camera is similarly angled at the model. Now, in doing this, Antonioni, as director, unmistakably links himself to Thomas as the photographer. He links himself in this way, both visually and thematically. And this connection between Antonioni and Thomas will become most explicit when the photographer later arranges his enlarged still photos from the park on the wall in order to construct a kind of cinematic narrative sequence, like a film director. Well, like Andrei Rublev, then, Blow Up is, among other things, a kind of portrait of the film artist, one in which the filmmaker explores his own creative impulse, his social function, and his ethical status through the works of his protagonist. And I think it's pretty clear here that Antonioni, in this connection, is not at all afraid to be hard on himself, not afraid at all to be deeply self-critical. At the same time, I think we'll find Antonioni's self-reflexivity during the fashion shoot, linking himself to Thomas and photography, remind male viewers of this film of our position as voyeurs as we watch the photographer's commanding gaze on the alluring, objectified female. Now, this inscription of the male viewer's position, like Rohmer's inscription of it in Claire's Knee, is controversial. And like Rohmer's film, this one again comes well before, in this case 7 years before Laura Mulvey's groundbreaking essay on the male gaze in cinema. Well, some critics argue that Antonioni is exposing the inherent violence and urge to power in the male gaze, both in life and in cinema. And I tend to agree with that. But other critics have accused Antonioni of actually encouraging his male viewers to indulge in sexual identification that Thomas's practices. Now, it is notable, I think, however, that unlike Truffaut's and Rohmer's males, Thomas takes no sexual pleasure simply in looking at women. His male gaze in and of itself carries no erotic delight, say the way Jules and Jim, or the way we find in the protagonist in Rohmer. And that is, I think, a crucial difference. Now, when 5 more models come in for a group shot, Thomas responds to them with disgust and abuse, misogyny. He frightens and intimidates them. "No chewing gum," he warns one. "Wake up," he screams at another. "Smile," he barks at a third. And then he criticizes their expressions and their poses as just, quote, horrible. Consider this abusive scene and then what immediately follows. Have a look.
Right, one more. And a smile now. Come on. Smile. Smile. God. I asked you to smile. What's the matter? I've got what a smile is. Hey! Ah, you're all tired now. Go on, relax. I can't see your eyeballs anymore. They're just slits. Go on. Close your eyes. Close your eyes. And stay like that. It's good for you.
Sometimes you really dig a girl, and you get distracted by her older sister when it wants her father and takes you.
Close your eyes. I must be 5 or 6 years old. They don't mean anything when I do them. Just a mess. Afterwards, I find something to hang on to. Like that. Like that leg. And it sorts itself out. And adds up. It's like finding a clue in a detective story. Don't ask me about this one, I don't know yet. Can I buy it? No. Will you give it to me? Tight-faced bastard. He won't flog me one of these crappy paintings. I'll creep down one night and knock it off. Don't stop, it's lovely.
You look tired.
I've been all night in a doss house.
Note that Thomas has mounted the camera in this shoot on a tripod, so he's not moving with these models as he had with Furushka. He is more removed from them, even less invested than he was there, even more deeply bored. In fact, he's so contemptuous of the models' collective ineptitude that after ordering them to close their eyes, he leaves them standing there while he goes to visit his neighbor, a painter named Bill, and his wife, Patricia. Well, the models, you'll note, are wearing mod outfits aimed at attracting the youthful exponents of the counterculture. In fact, the geometric patterns of their outfits recall the revelers at the start of the film, and one of the models is even in whiteface. But whatever revolutionary elements the counterculture might contain, it's pretty clear it has already been co-opted and absorbed as a kind of trend by canny designers who know that they can bring it and its style to the marketplace and make radical chic just another trend in pop culture. And so they do. Now, note that the non-diegetic soundtrack here has in the background, note that the non-diegetic soundtrack is something that Antonioni uses sparingly, but he does here with the song from the period, Have You Ever Had to Make Up Your Mind? The song is itself quintessentially a pop tune by the Lovin' Spoonful. Later, we'll see scenes in which we hear 4 songs by the Moody Blues, a band that Antonioni actually commissioned to write that music for Blow Up in order to evoke the ambience and the soundscape of swinging London in the 1960s. Now, Thomas's profession brings him into close contact, as we've noted, with pop culture, but his disdain for its mindless superficiality and his boredom with it is clear. By the same token, Thomas distinguishes between photography as a money-making necessity and photography as an art form, thus the collection of photographs that he hopes to publish. Well, when he goes to see his friend, as a fellow artist, Thomas takes an interest in Bill's paintings. In fact, he likes the painting that Bill is in fact perusing when he walks in. It's notable that Bill's own style here is retrospective. The portrait in question is done in the Cubist style of Picasso and Braque that harkens back to the early 20th century. There is, in short, a sense of tradition in Bill's art, an awareness of history on canvas, and this attracts Thomas, just as the items in the antique store attract him. He's disgusted with the present and is thus drawn to the past. Well, Bill's remark about his unfinished painting clearly look ahead to the central action of this film, to what Thomas discovers when he begins enlarging the photographs that he's taken in the park. The painter explains that he doesn't see or understand the meaning of his paintings, including this portrait, when he's in the act of creating them. It's only, he says, afterward, when he examines a canvas more closely and carefully and concentrates on a small piece of it, like that leg there, he says, only then that the work's significance is revealed to him. Then he says, quote, "I find something to hang on to. It sorts itself out. Things add up." In short, some underlying truth begins to emerge, he says, only when one examines an image or part of an image, only when one looks at something more closely, as Thomas certainly will when he enlarges the photographs from the park. Bill, notably here, in describing this focus on a particular part of a canvas that reveals some truth that he didn't know, he compares himself to a detective in a story looking for clues to uncover the meaning of what he has created. Now, a detective is also, of course, what Thomas will become as he scrutinizes through enlargements the details of the photographs that he has taken in the park. As such, both photographer and painter, one might say, occupy the double role of creators and interpreters of their own work. Well, when Patricia, played by Sarah Miles, comes in, she casts an unmistakably longing eye at Thomas. She pours him a beer and then massages his head. She is clearly in love with him. Thomas expects and enjoys having women serve him, so much so that it's difficult to imagine him in a relationship with anyone that isn't based on subservience. Told that the models have now opened their eyes finally, he told her to keep them closed, he tells his secretary to have them close their eyes again and then promptly departs once again, leaving in his wake 2 girls who have turned up uninvited in the desperate and fantastic hope that he will photograph them. Well, while Thomas is talking to these girls, you might remember that he manipulates a coin around his knuckles. It's a habit of his that reflects 2 things that draw him to a profession that he hates: money, the coin, and power, the manipulation. Thomas's activity throughout the first half of the film, then, consists primarily of abrupt departures that reflect what he refers to as his, quote, need to escape from his studio, to escape from Maud London, to escape from the fantasia of the swinging cultural present, and above all, to escape from his own boredom with these things. We soon find that there are 2 places that he gravitates toward, 2 places where this desire for escape leads him: to nature and to vestiges of the past. Have a look at this scene.
doing? Stop it! Stop it! Give me those pictures. You can't photograph people like that.
Who says I can't? I'm only doing my job. Some people are bullfighters. Some people are politicians. I'm a photographer.
This is a public place. Everyone has the right to be left in peace.
It's not my fault if there's no peace. You know, most girls would pay me to photograph them.
I'll pay you.
I have a charge. There are other things I want on the reel.
What do we do then?
I send you the photographs.
No, I want them now.
Now! What's the rush? Don't let's spoil everything. We've only just met.
No, we haven't met. You've never seen me.
When Thomas enters the park, camera in hand, having fled his studio, he has just come from an antique store where, amid dusty relics, he advises the suspicious old man on duty that he wants to buy a landscape painting. "No cheap bargains here," the old man tells him. Now, within the film's generational conflict, the old man refuses to believe that someone Thomas's age could possibly care about a painting from the past, or for that matter, about a painting that depicts a natural landscape. So instead, he tells Thomas that the painting's already been sold. In response, Thomas walks out into the natural landscape we see at the beginning of the clip, the bordering park. Antonioni presents his arrival there in a series of extreme long shots against the green lawns. Green lawns, you remember, that we saw at the very beginning of the film. On the one hand, these distant views emphasize the openness and beauty of nature that attracts Thomas to the park. It is a bucolic place where the city's cacophony is replaced by birdsong and the sound of wind through the trees. But these same shots evoke Thomas's isolation. These long shots evoke his alienation and disconnection from other people, like those long shots in La Ventura did on the island. Alienation is unmistakable here. Antonioni also gives us long-distance shots of Thomas secretly taking pictures, of him taking pictures of the couple that exactly mimic Thomas's own long-distance perspective on the couple, except that we see him within the shot sometimes. Now, this cuts two ways. In one sense, Antonioni is reminding us, through the parallelism of these long shots, his of Thomas and Thomas of the couple, of his own connection with Thomas as a filmmaker, as a man behind his own lens. Note that Antonio's own shots in this sequence also are almost entirely made with a still camera to mimic Thomas's still photographs. But Antonioni doesn't confine his view to the couple, to Thomas's voyeuristic gaze, nor does he confine our view to Thomas's gaze, and this cuts the other way. While we sometimes do see the couple from Thomas's point of view, and even share the view of them through his eyes through a telephoto lens at one point, at other moments, Antonioni significantly pulls back to show the photographer at a great distance, exposed to us in the act of voyeurism, much as we find Jerome exposed at crucial moments in Claire's knee by Romer in the act of spying. Now, By doing this, Antonioni doesn't make the audience entirely complicit in the photographer's covert detection. He allows us the distance with which to critique it. Well, Thomas first sees the couple by accident, but then he follows them. Curious. He watches from a great distance what looks like a loving embrace, and then he hides behind a fence to snap pictures of them. The woman seems to hear the click of the camera shutter, and we see her in a long shot turn and look in his direction. But undeterred, Thomas continues, ducking behind a tree as he moves closer. When the woman senses that she and her partner are being watched, they separate. But neither we nor Thomas hear what they say to one another. When they embrace again, the woman sees the photographer now unmistakably and chases Thomas. The pictures that Thomas is taking, remember, are intended to be the final images in a book of real photographs, that is, spontaneous and authentic, not posed in a studio. And yet, when the woman, played by Vanessa Redgrave, demands that he give them to her, Thomas behaves as if he were still in his studio and that he still enjoys the kind of proprietary rights that he would have there. Quote, "I'm a photographer," he tells her, even though they're in a public park. Well, the distinction that the woman tries to draw between public and private space is meaningless to Thomas. It's not that he feels free to photograph the couple because they're conducting a private affair in a public park. Rather, he feels free to do it because they are simply visible to the photographer's eye, which therefore, in his view, gives him the right to photograph anything. In Thomas's mind, his profession alone grants him voyeuristic license. Unlike most voyeurs, however, he shows absolutely no shame or alarm at being exposed. Normally, when Peeping Tom is revealed, he does, but not Thomas. He is supremely and selfishly confident. Instead, we find, the fantasy of control that male voyeurism confers actually continues for Thomas and is even increased after he is confronted by the woman. He's not only unabashed, but he now realizes that he enjoys a new form of power, one that he has over the woman. He has those photographic images, and the more she frantically offers to buy the pictures and then frantically tries and fails to wrest the camera out of his hands, the more he seems to be enjoying this sadistic power. Thomas responds to their physical struggle and to her biting his hand as if it were a kind of sexual foreplay. Thomas has absolutely no interest in the feelings of the people he has captured on film, in the studio or here. And though he is drawn to the park as a place of his own personal freedom, he shows no respect for the freedom of the couple that he sees there. His misogyny is most explicit when, in the sequence, he uses the camera not as a phallus as he had in the shoot with Verushka, but now as a kind of explicit weapon. He turns it on the woman when she comes toward him down the steps as if it were a loaded gun, and he continues to take shots of her even as she retreats in the distance in panic. Clearly, Antonioni is profoundly aware, then, of the moral dangers of filmmaking, and we'll see in the next lecture on Blow Up that the act of interpretation in this film can be just as perilous. I'll see you then.